With this lecture, we'll begin our study of Proverbs 25 through 29. This can be entitled, How May a Monarchy Attain Magnificence? Let's begin by considering the position of this series of chapters, which we will term a master lecture, within the context of the book of Proverbs. Solomonic materials edited by King Hezekiah's staff commence here in Proverbs 25 and extend through the close of chapter 29. The preceding Solomonic lecture, beginning in 22:17 and continuing through 24:34, concluded a series of teachings that actually began in Proverbs 10. With a voice reminiscent of a graduation commencement speaker, the sage there counseled youths who evidently were venturing into positions of leadership. That lecture drew to a close with a reprise spanning 24:15 to 22, and then a coda 24:23 to 34. The last two lines of the reprise rivet the youth's attention on a pair of powerful figures. Quote, "Revere the Lord, my son, and the King, and the ruin associated with both of them, who can fathom?" The same pair of significant figures, that is, deity and monarch, reappears in the first content verse of the present lecture, that is 25 verse 2, thereby creating continuity with Proverbs 25 and its preceding context. A second link creating continuity with the preceding portion consists of the expression used to set apart a group of sayings. So we read in 25:1a, "These two." Now, that particular beginning opened the coda that spanned 24:23 through 34. And here it opens the present lecture in 25 verse 1a. As far as content is concerned, the lecture that spanned 22:17 through the end of 24 advised youths concerning the implied question, "As I venture out, what must I pursue above all?" In contrast, the sage here in Proverbs 25 through 29 no longer envisions his pupils as juveniles who need rudimentary orientation for wise living. Instead, here he addresses newly minted kings who are intent on attaining personal and societal greatness, together with those who aspire to the royal court. So kings and courtiers making up a monarchy. The reader encounters an authorial transition upon leaving the material attributed to Solomon with the help of Hezekiah's editors. Non-Solomonic wisdom sources appear after this section, that is, following Proverbs 29. Thus we encounter the contributor Agur ben Yakeh and the mother of King Lemuel. Agur ben Yakeh right at the outset of chapter 30, and then the mother of King Lemuel at the outset of chapter 31. Next, let's consider structural features operating at the level of the master lecture in Proverbs 25 through 29. So before exploring the constituent parts of these 5 chapters, it'll be important to outline 5 of the most significant indicators of structure that lend cohesion across these 5 chapters. These are, first, the master lecture's 4-part structure revolving around a unifying question with 3 answers. Second, how those 3 answers form a cohesive whole. Third, evidence that a monarch's perspective spreads across these chapters. Fourth, evidence of the perspective of courtiers across these chapters. And fifth, evidence of the theme of magnificence across these same chapters. While these indications of structure do not exhaust the structures that unify the master lecture, they comprise the most fundamental links. And we will treat additional structures that operate at the high altitude master lecture level as we come to specific subportions within this 5-chapter series. So let's consider the first, the 4-part structure that spans the master lecture. It consists of a unifying question with 3 answers. The composition then spanning from Proverbs 25:1 all the way through the end of chapter 29 consists of an intricately composed master lecture that revolves around one implicit unifying question. The implicit question taken up by the sage can be expressed this way: how may a monarchy attain magnificence? Incidentally, within these chapters, Proverbs 25 through 29, when we refer to sage, we are referring to Solomon, who is credited at the outset as the source of these sayings, at the same time acknowledging, as we find in the first verse of 25, that they reflect the imprint and the arrangement of Hezekiah's staff. 4 portions, or sub-lectures, as we will call them, comprise this master lecture. You see them on the screen before you. The sage begins by framing the unifying question, how may a monarchy attain magnificence, in the first sub-lecture, and that sub-lecture can be entitled Introduction, Counsel for Kings and Courtiers in Quest of Magnificence. It spreads over the first 12 verses of Proverbs 25. That unifying question that you see at the top, how may a monarchy attain magnificence, shows up in the first 3 verses of chapter 25. After that, the sage initiates 3 condensed answers. The first part of the answer involves counsel to kings, and that will span 25 verses 4 and 5. The second part of the answer, counsel to courtiers. That will span 25, 6 through 10. The third part of the answer involves instruction concerning reproof. That will encompass verses 11 and 12, still in chapter 25. The balance of the master lecture, that is, picking up in 25:13, going through 26, 27, 28, and 29. The balance then of the master lecture will unfold those 3 answers in greater detail. Temporarily bypassing the first answer, that is, counsel to kings, when we come to the second sub-lecture, and you see it there, 25:13 to 27:22, this second sub-lecture enlarges on the second of those 3 answers, namely, counsel for courtiers expanded, individual magnificence, and the necessity to restrain greed, to refine generosity, and to prize reproof. Those are the elements that we find expanded from 25:13 through 27:22. And that counsel for courtiers was introduced in the first sub-lecture, verses 6 through 10 of chapter 25. As indicated in the title for the second sub-lecture, included as part of this counsel to courtiers is a substantial teaching concerning reproof. That constituted the third condensed answer. Counsel to kings, counsel to courtiers, and then instruction concerning reproof. The piece of it that we find embedded within counsel to courtiers is chapter 27, verses 5 to 18, where we find the launch for that in the introductory. The first sub-lecture is 25, 11, and 12. What about the third sub-lecture? This is different than the second and fourth. It serves as an interlude bridge, joining together counsel for courtiers, second sub-lecture, with counsel for kings, the fourth sub-lecture. This third sublecture could be titled A Portrait of Magnificent Management for both courtier and king. It's only 5 verses long, chapter 27, verses 23 through 27. Here the sage turns to the field of agriculture, and he likens astute management to the behavior of a wise farmer. Magnificence associated both with courtier and with the monarch are woven into this farming analogy. Mention of wealth recalls the prominence of courtiers. We find that term in 27:24a. While the last half of that verse, 27:24b, we find the word crown, and this clearly recalls the monarch. So in this fashion, the third sublecture masterfully transitions from the courtier council, that's the second sublecture, to the council for kings, the fourth sublecture, through this bridge. Waltke rightly notes the Janus, or looking forward, looking back function of this third sublecture. What about the fourth sublecture? Here the sage addresses from a king's perspective the quest for magnificence. It can be titled Counsel for Kings Expanded, National Magnificence and the Necessity to Intercept Greed, to Cultivate Generosity, and to Instill a Culture of Reproof. That begins at the start of chapter 28, continues through all of chapter 29. Linking it back to the introductory sublecture, then, we want to keep in mind that in chapter 25, verses 4 and 5, the sage indicated his interest in helping give instruction to kings. In particular, the sage focuses on the monarch's responsibility to interfere with greed by imposing judicial morality. We see that especially in the fourth sublecture, the portion that spans 29:3 through 14. A detailed analysis of greedy conduct would hone the monarch's ability to recognize guilt and would fortify his determination to rid it from his realm. That's what's going on in the first part of the fourth sublecture, that is, chapter 28, 1 through 27. After helping the monarch recognize and be fortified in his determination to rid it from his realm, chapter 28, then the start of chapter 29 very pointedly charges the king to act as a just judge. Just as the topic of reproof, keep in mind that was the third facet of the answer that we found in the introduction, just as this received substantial treatment toward the close of the second sublecture, we found that in 27, verses 5 through 18. Now again, toward the close of this fourth sublecture, again the sage returns to the topic of reproof, provides substantial instruction concerning it. That's located in 29, verses 15 through 23. The proximity within the fourth sublecture of the monarch's responsibility to impose judicial morality on the one hand, that's basically the first half of chapter 29, and on the other hand, the responsibility of parents and leaders to impose reproof, that's largely the last half of 29. This proximity may lead us to infer that the sage regards the monarch as chief reprover. We will clarify the distinction between the monarch and his role as just judge over against parents and rulers as reprovers when we come to that particular sublecture, for they are not really identical. There's a distinct difference between those. Let's sum up what we've seen concerning the structure that spans the master lecture, namely these 3 pieces of advice that would enable a monarchy to attain magnificence. We want to keep in mind that these three are prefigured in the introduction, that first sublecture. Counsel for kings, counsel for courtiers, and counsel concerning reproof. The first and second teachings, kings and courtiers, these will each expand into sublectures of their own. The second sublecture and the fourth sublecture. As far as reproof goes, each of those, that is, the courtier sublecture and the monarch or king sublecture, will contain portions that expand on the teaching of reproof. So reproof will not stand alone, but rather is embedded into both the courtier and the king sublectures. And between those two is sublecture number 3, the 5-verse bridge, which escorts us, the reader, from the courtier sublecture to the king sublecture. That was the passage where the sage models superior management, drawing from animal husbandry. Let's turn now to the second of these major observations regarding structure across the master lecture, and that is this. How is it that these three answers, kings, courtiers, and reproof, how do these unite to form a cohesive whole? Through this master lecture, the sage offers three answers to the question, how may a monarchy attain magnificence? When viewed together, these three answers combine to form a cohesive whole. And here's how. First, by focusing on courtiers, the sage teaches that a monarch may not achieve magnificence single-handedly. A significant observation. He or she must attend also to the character and quality of the courtiers that are accorded status within the royal court. Particularly, the monarch should identify and promote those who exhibit self-control regarding greed and shrewdness regarding generosity, advice that first appears in the first sublecture, chapter 25, verses 6 through 10, and then is expanded in the second sublecture. Second, the monarch must focus on enforcing justice and increasing the rule of law. We see this in chapter 25, verses 4 and 5 in the introduction, and then it's expanded in the fourth sublecture. Contrary to what some may assume, magnificence does not increase when persons of prominence scheme to simply expand their own wealth by the abuse of power. That the sage makes crystal clear in chapter 28. Authentic magnificence and joy will flourish only as morality operates with increasing freedom. We see this in chapter 8, verse 12, and 29, verse 2. A third element that helps us see these three answers uniting to form a cohesive whole has to do with the importance of reproof. After previewing reproof in the introduction, 25, 11, and 12, the sage expands this topic in three parts. Two of the three parts will appear in the second sublecture. The last will appear in the fourth sublecture. The first expanded teaching about reproof takes the viewpoint of someone who is receiving it or benefiting from it. There, the sage clarifies that for reproof to benefit a recipient, he or she must embrace two practices: cultivating trustworthy sources, that is, persons that he or she can trust that will speak into that person's life with care and with insight. And secondly, responding with receptivity to the confrontational counsel that they deliver. That combination, trustworthy sources and a receptive response, is packaged in the courtier second sublecture. It's chapter 27, verses 5 through 10. The second reproof teaching is also in the courtier sublecture. It takes the viewpoint not of the person receiving reproof, but now the viewpoint of the person transmitting reproof to someone else. Chapter 27, verses 11 to 18. Before attempting to administer reproof, the sage teaches one must grasp the principle on which it rests, namely, the capacity to avert disaster through foresight. Again, the capacity to avert disaster through foresight. This is a fundamental outlook and assumption of wisdom. Absent that foundation, wisdom does not work. So it's not surprising to find right there, embedded within this teaching about transmitting reproof, not surprising to find the sage stopping and saying, in effect, let's remember what is our foundation. Through wisdom, we can anticipate disaster, see it coming, and then sidestep it. That's in chapter 27, verse 12. In addition, a person transmitting reproof should be able to distinguish between failed models for issuing reproof and effective models for issuing reproof. There are right ways and wrong ways to go about that. That teaching comes in 27, 14 to 18. So the first teaching, receiving reproof, the second teaching, issuing reproof, are packaged back to back, both appearing toward the close of the Counsel for Courtiers, the second sublecture. The third and final teaching about reproof occurs as the sage has just finished describing the monarch's responsibility in his capacity as judge to protect society from the menace of greed. That teaching concerning the monarch as judge spans 29:3 to 14 and shows the king as the ultimate agent responsible to intercept greedy practices. The reproof teaching that follows immediately turns from ultimate agent to initial agents responsible for deterring greedy behavior, or, frankly, responsible for deterring any self-absorbed, non-productive behavior for that matter. This second group of agents is not the monarch, but now parents and rulers. The sage here cautions that if parents and rulers, and by rulers we're referring to any leaders in positions lesser than the monarch, if these abdicate their responsibility to reprove, then the youth or employee, in the case of a ruler, who is under their supervisory care will deteriorate into a menace to society. That reproof teaching spans 29:15 through 23. This appears toward the close of the fourth sublecture, that is, the Counsel for Kings. The second teaching about reproof, towards the end of the Counsel to Courtiers, and this last third teaching about reproof, toward the close of the Counsel to Kings. These two display cohesion through balanced mention of the parental pair. So we find in 27:11, a father's joy opens that second portion on reproof. On the other hand, it is a mother's shame which opens the third teaching on reproof in 29:15. This wraps up our second cohesive element, drawing together the master lecture from chapter 25 to 29. In the next portion of this video, we'll take up the third, namely evidence that a monarch's perspective spreads across Proverbs 25 through 29.